You're here this evening for the first 2013 Inspire Lecture on Literature and Sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, the winning team, please come forward. So, the team, led by Dr. Jayne Archer, we have Professor Richard Marggraf Turley and Professor Howard Thomas. So starting with you, Jane, if you can, three of you just say a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll move straight into the lecture.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jayne Archer. I'm a lecturer in Renaissance Studies in the Department of English and Creative Writing at the University of Aberystwyth.
And I'm Richard Marggraf Turley. I'm a romanticist by trade, and I'm also the Professor of Engagement with the Public Imagination at Aberystwyth University.
I'm Howard Thomas. I'm an emeritus professor in the Institute of Biological, Environmental and Rural Sciences at Aberystwyth, and I'm a plant scientist, a geneticist by trade.
So, maybe an unusual collaboration, but between them, they are going to bring us now Reading with the Grain, Sustainability and the Literary Imagination.
Okay, thank you, Jane. The intricacy of biological and physical systems on our planet means that any effective approach to sustainable development must be attuned to daunting levels of complexity. Such is the unpredictability of these systems that some commentators warn us to treat any new plan that involves claims of sustainability as immediately suspect. For John P. O'Grady, the concept of sustainability itself may be unsustainable. But for anyone committed to embedding sustainability in public policy, including those, which is to say, all of us, who are invited to respond to the Welsh Government's 2013 White Paper on Sustainable Development, the challenge needn't prompt us to counsels of despair. On the contrary, the White Paper presents a welcome invitation to poets, writers, and literary critics for whom the uncertain, ineffable, and numinous are in fact familiar, and dare I say comfortable ground, to make a transformative contribution to debates around sustainability. Human motivations and responses are at least as complex and unpredictable as the ecosystems we aim to manage. And it is, as O'Grady insists, incumbent upon scientists and managers when compiling taxonomies and generating data sets for environmental decision-making to take into account the full expanse of the human mind with all its curious flora and fauna. So how might the curious flora and fauna of the human mind then be deployed to help reimagine the relationship between literature and sustainability? How might we move beyond studies of the representation of the environment in literature and instead foster a two-way conversation between these categories? How might we conceive of a relationship that holds the genuine possibility of enabling the creative arts to help shape the contours of increasingly important aspects of public policy? The mathematician and zoologist Donald Ludwig, together with his co-authors Ray Hilborn and Carl Waters, offer something intriguingly suggestive, though it might at first seem counterintuitive to writers and readers. They assert that it's more important to think of resources as managing humans than the converse. That is, in short, a self-sustaining environment manages, that is to say, authors, its own writers. So in this lecture, let us consider one historical example of a creative response to the drive for sustainable futures that allows us to navigate the tangled relationship between literature and sustainability. The golden age of Renaissance English literature, which is to say the years 1575 to 1625, coincided with what is now known as the Little Ice Age, a time of rapid cooling following the so-called medieval warm period. During this half-century, England, Scotland, and Wales experienced climatic disturbances as disconcerting as those that we are familiar with in the present. It was, as it is now in parts of the world, an age of heightened awareness of food insecurity. Sharp winters, followed by wet summers, resulted in many consecutive poor harvests. For large swathes of the population, existence was precarious. People lived, quite literally, on the breadline. Government attempts to manage this crisis targeted the production, the price, and distribution of arable crops within and without the nation's borders. But anger at the failure of these regulatory measures, coupled with sheer desperation, led to riots erupting across many regions. For most people, it was a time of dearth. But for those few with ready cash, it was a time of opportunity. One Warwickshire man, the son of a butcher, a moneylender, and wool trader, among many other occupations, saw his chance. Over a 15-year period, he purchased and stored grain, malt, and barley for resale at inflated prices to neighbours and local tradesmen. In February 1598, he was prosecuted for holding 80 bushels of malt or corn during a time of shortage. This man pursued those who could not or would not pay him in full for these staple goods, and used the profits to further his own money-lending activities. In July 1604, he sued an apothecary, Philip Rogers, for 35 shillings and 10 pence plus 10 pence damages, seeking to recover the unpaid balance on a sale of 20 bushels of malt and a small loan in March of that year. His profits were channeled into a programme of land purchase, comprising, by 1602, not just bricks and mortar, or rather timber and thatch, wattle and daub, but 20 acres of pasture and 107 acres of land suitable for the cultivation of arable crops. In addition, and looking to the longer term, he acquired tithes on local produce, including a tithe on corn, grain, blade, and hay, therefore allowing him to cream off the profits made from the manual work of others. Combining both illegal and legal activities, this Warwickshire man was able to retire in 1613 after a working life, at least a working life that we know of approximately 24 years. The largest property owner in his hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon. His two daughters, who inherited their father's leases, land and property, married well, though, admittedly, not in one case happily, and lived in sizable townhouses nearby. This man was William Shakespeare. It might come as a shock that the Shakespeare we thought we knew considered himself a manager of land and commodities first, and as a playwright and poet second. But to return to the starting point of this lecture, Shakespeare allowed natural resources to manage his life choices, and he profited, and arguably we profited as a consequence. The need to ensure a sustainable future for himself and his family informed, at every level, his literary career. But it turns out that the evidence for seeing Shakespeare in this way, in the way that he saw himself, was there all along. Nicholas Rowe, Shakespeare's first biographer, got it right when he imagined the bard a couple of years before he moved to London and started writing as an unemployed father of three, so desperate for food that he poached rabbits and deer in the grounds of Charlecote Park, Warwickshire. But the most arresting evidence for the importance of sustenance in Shakespeare's life has really all but been staring us in the face for years.
Literally staring us in the face. I think now you are permitted to open your pamphlets. And if you look near the end, you'll see 3 figures. Take a look at figure 1. It's the Shakespeare funerary bust in Holy Trinity Church, Stratford-upon-Avon. It's a relic that's perplexed generations of artists and scholars. It was derided as a silly, smiling thing by Thomas Gainsborough, no less. To the critic and biographer J. Dover Wilson, it bore the likeness of a self-satisfied pork butcher. And let's face it, the monument does seem better suited to the top of a barrel organ than a church chancel. But we should remember that the bust now on view isn't the original. Shakespeare's son-in-law, John Hall, commissioned the earliest funerary monument, which was installed sometime before 1623. The precise date is unknown. The sculptor was the German Gerhard Janssen, one of whose clients was Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton. There's every reason to assume that the original monument, which was made by and for those who knew Shakespeare well, was a faithful depiction of the man. We have a good idea of how it appeared to first viewers. William Dugdale, historian of Warwickshire, made a sketch of the monument in 1634, and we also have an engraving of the sketch from the engraver and antiquary George Virtue. Figures 2 and 3 in your pamphlet show how Dugdale and Virtue saw the bust. What do we see? The original funerary bust remembers a businessman who is clutching what is quite clearly a sack of corn. This is significant. We can imagine that sack, holding about a bushel of grain, is ready to be sold to the highest bidder. This interpretation of the composition of the monument is at odds with how most Shakespeare scholars have read the evidence afforded by Dugdale's sketch. It's as if they wish to conceal from public view any suggestion that the creative genius behind the poems and plays was a mere provincial tradesman from Stratford-upon-Avon. Seemingly, the 18th century renovators shared and perpetuated this prejudice by replacing the bushel of grain, clearly discernible as such in Virtue's sketch, with a velvet cushion and quill. Thus, literary historians, by omitting the inconvenient evidence, have been complicit in the manufacture of the myth. Shakespeare, the grain hoarder, has been redacted from history so that Shakespeare, the creative genius, could be born. With this act of silencing, we lose evidence of the symbolic relationship between the drive for sustainability and literary creativity. The wise Pharaoh of the Old Testament followed the advice of Joseph and stored surplus grain during the good years so that his people could eat during times of famine. Shakespeare could also justify his grain hoarding as ultimately being in the public interest. Unlike the local authorities, he had a ready store of food available for purchase when supplies ran low. Why shouldn't this prudent response to an unpredictable supply of natural resources be something to be proud of and commemorated in a funerary monument? And why shouldn't Shakespeare, like Joseph, the favored son, profit from that same public need? We know that London playhouses closed during the summer months. This meant that Shakespeare had the money and the off-season freedom to devote time to the serious business of sustenance. The original bust shows us that Shakespeare responded to this opportunity both by writing plays and by dealing in commodities. We might say he was feeding the wants as well as the needs of his fellow countrymen. Far from pulling in opposite directions, these twin businesses of plays and food were interrelated and mutually supporting. Shakespeare was no fool. He knew that appropriating the means of production as well as the produce itself would give him a monopoly in the only thing that no one could do without, which is food. Well, he suffered a few fines for illegal hoarding and tax evasion, but these were little more than minor business expenses. Shakespeare's business, purveyor of bread, beer, and plays, was so profitable that he was able to buy up land around the place of his birth and finally to return there on a permanent basis sometime before 1616 as one of the most powerful property owners in the region. Having ensured a comfortable, sustainable future for himself and his family, Shakespeare stopped writing. Sustenance and sustainability might sound like a lost work of Jane Austen, but in fact they describe the significant preoccupations of Shakespeare's life. Sustenance, a basic need and a source of creativity that Shakespeare placed at the center of his revisioning of Britain and her people, a revisioning with one eye on the arable fields and pastures of Warwickshire and another set on the barren, overpopulated sprawl of the City of London. And sustainability. Shakespeare used his writing not only to fund his grain hoarding, but also to represent and reimagine the contemporary battle of sustainability. Looked at this way, we can see how the politics of sustenance is written into the fabric, into the very grain, as it were, of Shakespeare's characters, language, and plots. It is desperation for cheap grain that results in the nadir of English fortunes, the lifting of the siege of Rouen in Henry VI, Part 1. French forces, led by Joan of Arc, hide within sacks of adulterated corn. Now there's a thought. Adulteration of the food chain. How fortunate such a calamity could never happen in our time. Treason is figured as a crisis of sustenance. Think of a lean and hungry Cassius in Julius Caesar, or the plebeian cockle that threatens to spoil the patrician corn of Coriolanus' Rome. Think of Falstaff, a man who, unlike Cassius, can hardly be accused of thinking too much, is equally threatening to the stability of the state, and precisely because he is unable to moderate his appetite. Think of Henry V, where, in the Duke of Burgundy's estimation, France is defeated as much by her own inadequate agricultural methods as by the English army at Agincourt. Her husbandry doth lie on heaps, the French nobleman laments, corrupting in its own fertility. The same is true of the world of King Lear, in which a monarch's political errors symbolized by his crown of idle weeds, which he plucks from unharvested fields of sustaining corn, result in an all-consuming dearth.
This political environmental discourse, which required sophisticated knowledge of arable plants and farming techniques, would have been immediately recognizable to Shakespeare's first audiences, many of whom, like the man from Stratford-upon-Avon himself, had come to London from farming families and regions. For them, the contemporary crisis of sustainable food supply, encompassing ownership of land, food purity and supply routes, as well as regulation of measures and prices, was one of, if not the, most pressing political issues. The word sustainability was not known to Shakespeare, the coiner of so many words, but sustenance and the concept we now understand as sustainability, namely human activity in which environmental degradation is minimized, was certainly not unknown. Of the 21 allusions to sustenance and its variants in Shakespeare's plays, 5 of them appear in King Lear. And it is this mature work that realizes most fully the fraught intertwining of limited resources and unpredictable and ungovernable natural systems, and also the role of the curious flora and fauna of the human mind when attempting to manage those systems. The play reveals this fascinating, most urgent dynamic in its very first scene. Positioned suggestively next to a map of Britain, an enraged Lear declares that he will divide his retirement between the courts of his 2 eldest daughters, Goneril and Regan. And to quote Lear, "Ourself by monthly course, with reservation of 100 nights, by you to be sustained, shall our abode make with you by due turn. Of course, Goneril and Regan don't play ball. Having accepted their father's bequests of land, they don't then actually agree to sustain him and his 100 knights. Now, this isn't simply sustain as endurance or putting up with. This is sustain as resource management. And as such, it conforms to our current understanding of sustainability, namely the socio-environmental concept defined in the UN's Brundtland Commission report of 1987 as, and I quote, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. In the first act of King Lear, the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, including the long-term security of the bastard Edmund, is precisely what is at stake. And this ability is being compromised by the actions of the present ruler. Goneril and Regan, the daughters, who have their own courts to run, cannot accommodate, feed, and maintain Lear, who expects the trappings of kingship without the inconvenient responsibilities, and his retinue for 6 out of 12 months of the year. Now, when one's father is, or rather was, king, the domestic politics of sustainability segues into national and international politics. The bounty awarded to Goneril and Regan at the beginning of the play as payment for their declarations of love are portions of land that are not self-sustaining. Here, as in the 2013 Welsh Government White Paper, sustainability is central to the politics of devolution, the division of the kingdoms. Goneril receiving Scotland and the north, and Regan taking Wales and the West Country are assigned, in Lear's own estimation, very similar lands. And as he puts it, these are shadowy forests and wide-skirted meads. Of course, forests and pastures do not produce corn. It's for Cordelia that Lear reserves the corn-rich lands of central and southern England. Now, Shakespeare's first audiences would have recognised this filial spat as a resource war and as a struggle for the long-term sustainability that alone guarantees and ensures national security. In the estimation of the Tudor historian William Harrison, England was believed to be more fruitful than Wales, and Wales and England both more bountiful than Scotland. So Scotland, the north, Wales, the west, the portions given to Goneril and to Regan respectively, were thought to be unable to produce sufficient food to feed their populations. And Anglesey, which of course is Wales's, or was Wales's, breadbasket was vulnerable to siege from the sea. So when Goneril and Regan are compared to serpents and to wolves, to ravenous carnivores and predators, as they are throughout the play, it is for a very good reason. Neither one owns lands that can produce the arable crops necessary to safeguard the long-term survival of their subjects. They must predate the resources of adjoining land, namely land that has been reserved for Cordelia. So, sustainability forms a deep structure in King Lear. It works imaginatively, emotionally, as well as intellectually and strategically, because the family drama is so tightly folded into the politico-environmental crisis. It, and other plays by Shakespeare, ask to be read, reread, and reimagined in light of and as a continuation of Shakespeare's own career as a grain hoarder, a dealer in commodities, and the owner of food-producing land. Now, literary critics are used to reading literature against itself to produce new interpretations, but actually we need to read Shakespeare's plays with the grain. To revise Ludwig et al.'s formulation, in light of the insights yielded by King Lear, resources manage humans and humans manage resources. The relationship is reciprocal. Mediating that relationship is literary creativity, through which the environment authors its writers, and those writers author their environment. What then do we see when we view the Shakespeare Funerary Monument today? Perhaps we see a middle-aged man resting his manuscripts on a tasseled velvet cushion, a man whose genius transcends time and place, a soul, to misquote Ben Jonson, of all ages. But perhaps we now also see something more challenging and ultimately more revealing. A playwright who lived during a crisis of sustenance, who wrote about that crisis, shaped the ways in which it was imagined, contributed to public debates about its management and amelioration, and who took smart measures to protect himself and his family from its worst depredations. If the latter, then Shakespeare is a soul for our age too, and his life and works can teach us invaluable lessons about our own precarious relationship with the land. The editors of the recent anthology Ecocritical Shakespeare ask whether, quote, reading, writing about, and teaching Shakespeare can contribute to the health of the planet. We should be skeptical of such claims. All the same, reading, writing about, and teaching Shakespeare as acts that encompass the stories Shakespeare told, as well as the stories told about Shakespeare, can certainly help us to think critically and creatively about the health of the planet. So to finish, the original Shakespeare Funerary Monument remembers what we in the well-fed West have largely forgotten, namely the insistent and urgent coupling of food and literature, sustenance and consumption, the continual digestion and transformation of matter, energy, ideas, and information. It memorializes the strange alchemy by which literary manuscripts are translated into performance, playhouse takings into natural resources, and commodities converted into land and property. So if we recoil from this equation, it is because we, unlike the young Shakespeare and his contemporaries, believe we know where our next meal, our warmth, our light, and our night's sleep are coming from. Creativity is inspired by hungry bellies as much as by the satisfied paunch traced in the Holy Trinity effigy. And the periodic crises of sustenance that have shaped the tumultuous history of these islands have been fuel for poets and playwrights as much as for politicians. As readers and writers, we are at the heart of that process. Thank you very much.